initiated by President Trump was a negotiation to determine who would be in power, what areas they would hold, and when the United States would leave. It was President Trump who initiated that negotiation, not President Biden. President Biden, when he took office, followed through with it. I applauded him for doing so. I realize, and I think everyone does, the situation in Afghanistan is perilous, but I think that we ought to acknowledge the obvious. After the longest war in the history of the United States, after losing over 1,000 American lives and tens of thousands wounded, after spending trillions of dollars, we were not winning in Afghanistan. We didn't have a winning hand or a winning strategy. The Taliban was still a viable political force, and the Afghan security forces many times were overwhelmed by that Taliban force. I wonder why the Republican leader from Kentucky doesn't do the obvious. He has the authority under the rules of the Senate to introduce a measure authorizing the use of military force in Afghanistan. If he believes we should stay or send more troops there, that is his right. He can offer that on the floor of the Senate. Instead of lamenting what has happened there, he has the authority, if he thinks we've abandoned the Afghan people and should go back into that country, why doesn't he offer that? An authorization of use of military force. I think we know the answer. There's little or no support on his side of the aisle, nor on this side of the aisle, to make the longest war in American history even longer. Yes, we should be a viable force to try to make certain the Afghan people have a fighting chance. But after almost 20 years at it, I think we have shown that our strategy was not the winning strategy. Madam President, on a different subject, as our nations continue to emerge from COVID-19 restrictions, vaccinated Americans are able to gather safely this past weekend for two happy events, Father's Day and the first Juneteenth federal holiday. These celebrations came at the end of a week that brought welcome news to America. After years, 11 years of fighting the Affordable Care Act, the Supreme Court finally said to the Republicans, enough. Millions of Americans have health insurance at a time when they desperately need it in the midst of a pandemic, and your theories on Constitution and law are not adequate to end the Affordable Care Act. Thank goodness for that ruling, 7-2 ruling. The administration, of course, was heartened by that and by the knowledge that we are fast approaching the point where 70% of the adults in America are going to be vaccinated. Remember when President Biden took office 6 months ago? Yes, we had the vaccines, but we hadn't produced them in quantity, and we didn't have a plan for vaccinating America. Thank goodness. Now, the United States is leading the world in the effort to vaccinate its population. And I thank President Biden for that and the resources that we provided to him. We still have a challenge. We still have a threat. The Delta variant is much more easily spread than the COVID strain that shut down the nation last year. It has now been identified in 41 states. For those who are holding back and not seeking a vaccination, they are in greater danger than they were a year ago if that infection comes near them. I hope my Republican colleagues will join the Democrats in urging Americans to be vaccinated as quickly as possible. On a different topic, Madam President, last week marked the 50-year anniversary of President Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs. Today, America imprisons a greater share of its population than any nation on earth. Drugs are cheaper and more easily available than ever, and substance abuse is destroying more American families than ever. The greatest harm has fallen on our most vulnerable citizens, particularly low-income Americans and communities of color. During the first 4 decades of the Nixon war on drugs, America's federal prison population grew by 700%. And the cost of operating federal prisons exploded by 1,100%. Today, nearly half the people in federal prison are locked up due to drug-related charges. We are learning the hard way. We can't jail our way out of a public health crisis. In recent years, the Senate's come together on a significant bipartisan basis to correct some of the gravest mistakes of the war on drugs. I'm grateful to my friend, the ranking Republican member on the Judiciary Committee, Senator Chuck Grassley, for his leadership in this effort. We have been a partnership, bipartisan partnership, that ended up sending the First Step Act, a reform movement, to President Bush to sign into law. President Trump to sign into law. Tomorrow, the Senate Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing on another crucial piece of reform, eliminating the disparate treatment of crack and powder cocaine under federal sentencing laws. Congress established this unjust sentencing disparity at the height of the crack epidemic in the 1980s, based on fear and mistaken allusions to science. We reduced the disparity with the Fair Sentencing Act, but we didn't eliminate it. Today, a person arrested for 28 grams of crack will receive the same sentence as a person with 500 grams of cocaine powder, even though it's exactly the same drug. This lingering disparity made racial inequities in our criminal justice system even worse, undermined faith in the integrity of our justice system, and worst of all, failed to even curb drug addiction in America. Talk about three strikes. We should eliminate the disparity once and for all, and there'll be a hearing tomorrow. On another matter, Madam President, tomorrow our democracy will face one of its greatest tests in the Senate. On January 7th, at close to 4 o'clock in the morning, this Senate voted to confirm the electoral victory of Joe Biden to be the next president of the United States. But we all know what happened before that vote. An angry, self-pitying man who would not accept defeat, we now know, schemed for weeks about how to overturn the election and to continue his presidency. When Donald Trump's efforts failed and democracy prevailed, he begged a mob to come to Washington and deliver him from reality. You've seen the videos and films, the president standing with the White House in the background, railing to this crowd about an election that was stolen, urging them to come to Capitol Hill and make a difference. He demanded that they come and stop the steal. And then he turned that mob on the Capitol of the United States. Those of us who were here that day will never forget it. The outrageous insurrection that followed was the worst attack on this building and the most prolonged siege of the Capitol since the British attacked our capital in the War of 1812. 5 people died, more than 140 police officers were injured. It could have been worse. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, South Carolina, was right when he said the day after the attack, quote, "That mob could have killed us all." The assault on the Capitol left our nation shaken and the world in disbelief that it could happen in America. But it was not what had one group of Washington power peddlers worried the most. These Washington insiders scheduled a private conference call just 2 days after this attack on the Capitol. They were scrambling to come up with a plan to kill a democracy reform bill. The call was organized by the Koch brothers organization. Among the participants was Senator McConnell. A recording of the call found its way to Jane Mayer, an investigative reporter for the New Yorker magazine, who wrote about it. According to Miss Mayer's reporting, the reason the political insiders and special interests on that call were frightened was because they couldn't find a way to beat S1. The Koch brothers group had poll tested every attack they could think of against the bill, and none of it worked. It wasn't just Democrats who liked the reforms in that bill. It turned out the Republicans liked them too. According to a Koch representative who hosted the meeting, quote, "There's a very large chunk of conservatives who are supportive of these types of reforms." Surprise, surprise. What's a poor political insider to do when you can't manufacture a reason to vote against a bill? There's only one way to stop it. And what they referred to was under the dome strategies to stop this electoral reform bill. You know what that is? That's the filibuster. the filibuster, that Senate procedure which requires 60 votes. They knew they couldn't win a majority, but they knew that it was tough to come up with 60 votes in favor. And that's what I'm afraid we're going to see tomorrow. I hope not. Last night I watched with many Americans as the movie Selma was televised. It reminded us of what happened in the 1960s when people like my personal friend and a hero to many of us, John Lewis, marched across that bridge in Selma, Alabama, trying to speak up for what? Voting rights for African Americans. He was beaten and bloodied and almost died in the process. But they mustered the strength to come back again and to resume the march. And they prevailed in passing a Voting Rights Act that gave a fighting chance for African Americans and other people to be able to vote in the future of America. This still is a challenge to us today. Why, I don't know. We've seen in the recent past 6 or 7 Republicans publicly break with Donald Trump in some of his more outrageous positions. And yet they have been strangely silent on that side of the aisle when it comes to what is happening in states across the nation, where we have measures taking place that will limit the right of people to vote. What's wrong with this picture? Is a democracy not at its strongest point when more people are participating? And yet Republican legislatures write bill after bill to limit those who will be able to vote in the future. I want to say a word or two about my colleague, Senator Joe Manchin. I want to thank him for his determined efforts to find a compromise on the bill that's coming before us. Senator Manchin spoke to everyone in sight, Republicans, Democrats, independents, liberals, conservatives, and he listened. The compromise he proposed is not inclusive of everything I'd like to see in the bill, but the reality is that it would be an improvement. It would help address the dangerous all-out assault on voting rights that's taking place in all these states that I mentioned. It could help put Jim Crow back in the grave where he belongs, and it deserves the support of the Senate. My last word before I close. I had the honor of serving with Senator Robert Byrd. He used to sit back here. And I remember standing in front of his desk as a new United States Senator, and he told me in his illustrious Senate career the things he was embarrassed by the most. He talked about deregulation of airlines, which took the planes out of his state of West Virginia. He talked about a nominee for the Eisenhower cabinet who was rejected because he was Jewish. He told me he was wrong in the way he voted on those measures. But he said, Mr. Durbin, more than anything, I was wrong on civil rights. Madam President, this past Saturday was not only Juneteenth, it was the 57th anniversary of the Senate's passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It had been filibustered for 2 months before it passed. Opposition to the bill wasn't divided along party lines, but I'll be very honest. My party, the Democratic Party, particularly Southern members of the party, were leading the fight against it. On June 8th, 1964, one of the most conservative Democrats stood on the floor with an 800-page speech filled with all kinds of reasoning about why civil rights was unnecessary and an infringement on states' rights, an echo of a speech we just heard on the Senate floor. That senator's name was Robert C. Byrd. He spoke on this floor for 14 hours and 13 minutes. When he finished, the majority leader called the roll and 71 senators voted to end the filibuster, 4 more than was needed. 10 days later, on Juneteenth, 1964, the Senate passed the Civil Rights Act. On July 2nd, it passed the House, was signed by President Johnson. Robert C. Byrd would go on to serve for another 46 years in the Senate, become majority leader twice, and the longest serving senator in history. He later called his filibuster of the Civil Rights Act, quote, the worst mistake of my life, a decision which he told me personally he deeply regretted. He would change. He would begin to champion civil rights. When President George W. Bush signed the law extending voting rights in 2006, it was Robert C. Byrd by his side in the Oval Office, along with Ted Kennedy and John Lewis. When Robert Byrd died in 2010, John Lewis mourned him and called him an ally and true statesman. Yet despite all the years that had passed and all the good he accomplished, prominent in many articles about his death was the fact that he once stood against civil rights. None of us knows how long we have to serve in the Senate, or even on this earth. If the last year has taught us anything, life is fragile. So I implore my colleagues who may be wrestling with how to vote tomorrow, this is a vote for history. This is democracy on trial. Think about how you want to be remembered by your children's children. If democracy is worth fighting for, even worth dying for, surely a democracy reform bill is worthy of debate in the Senate. Allow the Senate to do its job and debate the For the People Act. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. I come to the floor today to join my colleague, Senator Collins from Maine, who will be here shortly, who is also my co-chair of the Diabetes Caucus, to reintroduce the Improving Medicare Beneficiary Access to Innovative Diabetes Technologies Act. This is legislation that would establish a task force to provide recommendations to help guide Medicare's decisions on coverage and payment for new technologies to improve the lives of people with diabetes. Now, I have had the opportunity to see the challenges that families with members who have type 1 diabetes face. My granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter, has type 1. And I know the challenges that her family faces navigating a complex web of insurance coverage rules for technologies. Anytime a new technology comes out that would benefit her, to get the insurance companies to adopt those technologies is a huge challenge. And it requires hours of phone time with the insurance company trying to persuade them that they should provide the coverage. Well, we know that these insurance companies often base their coverage and reimbursement rules on Medicare. And that's why it's so important for the Medicare program to keep pace with the development of new diabetes technologies and devices. I appreciate the opportunity to work with Senator Collins on a regular basis in the Diabetes Caucus. And in 2017, we were successful in pressing Medicare to cover continuous glucose monitors, something that seems like an obvious choice, given the difference that those CGMs can make for people who have diabetes in ensuring that their blood sugar stays stable. We've also worked together to ensure that Medicare provides flexibility so that patients can use smartphone apps with their continuous glucose monitors. And in the years to come, we need Medicare to make progress toward covering the artificial pancreas, a landmark development that will be the most significant change for people with diabetes since insulin was discovered. But to do this, we shouldn't have to resign ourselves to this piecemeal approach to Medicare coverage that requires continual pressure from Congress and advocates. We need an independent body like the one that's identified in our legislation to help provide recommendations to Medicare so that its coverage of new technologies can adapt more quickly as innovation advances. That's why I'm proud to be here on the floor and proud to join Senator Collins in reintroducing this bill. I hope that my colleagues will take a look at it, decide that it merits passage, and work with us to get that done. So my colleague has arrived on the floor, Senator Collins. I was just saying that I was very proud to be able to join you in reintroducing this legislation, and hopefully this session we will be able to get it done. So thank you for your leadership, and I look forward to hearing your comments and to working to get this passed.
Madam President,
Senator from Maine.
thank you, Madam President. First, let me thank my colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, for her extraordinary commitment and leadership as my fellow co-chair of the Senate Diabetes Caucus. We are introducing a bill to improve access to innovative diabetes technologies for our seniors and other Medicare beneficiaries. Our bill would create a special task force at the Department of Health and Human Services to examine and resolve barriers that seniors face in accessing the latest diabetes technologies. New diabetes technologies such as the artificial pancreas and implantable continuous glucose monitoring systems allow those who are living with diabetes to better manage their glycemic levels, assess needed therapy on a timely basis, and adhere better to treatment regimes. These technological advances make diabetes easier to manage and therefore improve the health of people with diabetes. The market arrival of cutting-edge diabetes technologies is something that we all celebrate. However, oftentimes we're finding that patients do not realize the full benefits because many of our nation's seniors find the new technologies to be difficult or impossible for them to afford. I have heard from numerous seniors who, when transitioning from employer-provided insurance to Medicare, were shocked to learn that the technologies that they'd relied upon for years to manage their diabetes are no longer covered because they now have lost their employer-provided insurance, which did cover these technologies, and instead are being covered by Medicare. For example, one Mainer unfortunately had to face the reality that Medicare's coverage denial of a particular sensor that he needed for his insulin pump meant paying up to $8,000 out of pocket each year if he wants to continue with his current treatment. He wrote, "Because I am now 65, I am denied care that was available when I was 64." He continued, "This approach not only puts me at risk, but quite likely is not cost effective. While the sensors are expensive, the cost of ambulance calls and hospitalizations is certainly more." Madam President, I could not say it better. It makes no sense for this individual who is aged into the Medicare system to lose coverage that he had and relied upon and used successfully to control his diabetes. To better support the adoption of these technologies, our bill would require HHS to create a special task force on coverage and payment for innovative diabetes technologies that would bring all stakeholders, from patients to device manufacturers to government officials and healthcare professionals who are making coverage decisions, to the table. The task force would identify and plan for changes in Medicare coverage and payment policies to ensure that Medicare beneficiaries have access to the latest treatments, to the innovation that are currently available, as well as those that are in the pipeline. The task force would also be tasked with developing strategies for supporting adoption of these technologies. This effort builds on our past advocacy to improve the day-to-day life of individuals with diabetes. In January 2017, in response to the bipartisan effort that Senator Shaheen and I led, CMS first approved the use of continuous glucose monitors. We also successfully urged CMS last year to support the use of smartphone apps in conjunction with continuous glucose monitors. These are proven life-saving devices that are relied upon by people with diabetes to provide them with real-time measurements of their glucose levels. This information is key to preventing costly, sometimes deadly, diabetes complications. Madam President, while I am pleased that our advocacy has helped spur these policy changes, I remain frustrated that too often Medicare lags behind commercial insurers. Greater adoption of these new diabetes techniques can help address the explosive growth in the financial and human toll of diabetes. Diabetes accounts for an extraordinary $1 in $3 in Medicare spending. It is paramount that we encourage HHS to adopt a more cost-effective and compassionate approach to treating this chronic disease that affects more than 30 million Americans. The Improving Medicare Beneficiary Access to Innovative Diabetes Technologies Act encourages a proactive approach to diabetes coverage and payment. I encourage my colleagues to support our efforts. Thank you, Madam President. And again, my thanks to my partner, Senator Shaheen, for her leadership in this area.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, last week, Congress notched another bipartisan win for the American people. A bill I reintroduced earlier this year, along with Senator Markey from Massachusetts, was signed into law, finally establishing Juneteenth as a national holiday. This bill was unanimously supported in the Senate and got an overwhelming vote in the House of Representatives. And I was honored to be with President Biden at the White House when he signed it into law late last week. And it was even more special to celebrate with my fellow Texans over the weekend. On Saturday, I was honored to spend the very first Juneteenth National Independence Day in Galveston, where Major General Gordon Granger and his troops declared that all slaves were forever free. This happened 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and just a couple of months after hostilities between the North and the South had ended. But communication being what it is, across a huge country, particularly at that time, it took 2.5 years for the message to get to the former slaves in Galveston, Texas, where Juneteenth has been celebrated for many, many years. And in my state alone, we've celebrated Juneteenth for 40 years as a state holiday. I could not have been more happy to take a piece of history with me, a copy of the bipartisan bill that helped preserve the legacy of Juneteenth for generations to come. Madam President, this is just the one item in a significant list of bipartisan accomplishments we've made in an equally divided Senate, which, as we all know, is no small thing. Legislation to confront the growing threats of China, to ensure more businesses can grab onto the lifeline of the Paycheck Protection Program, one of the most significant economic assistance, items of economic assistance that we were able to provide during the COVID-19 virus. We provided states with additional resources to upgrade their drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. And we passed legislation to combat hate crimes against Asian Americans. So the truth is, notwithstanding what it may look like in the news or on cable TV or on social media, every day our colleagues here in the Senate continue to work across the aisle to find consensus and to craft legislation with bipartisan support where we can. I tell people that legislation is hard to pass by design. And our current rules require us to do the hard work of actually building consensus on a bipartisan basis before we can pass legislation, particularly in the Senate. But we continue to do our work in other important areas like infrastructure, which has been the subject of so much attention and debate, to do police reform, to deal with the high price of prescription drugs. Republicans and Democrats continue to work together to address some of our most urgent problems. But this week, unfortunately, the majority leader, the senator from New York, has decided to take another tack. He's chosen to spend the Senate's time on partisan legislation that simply has no chance of becoming law. That's his choice. He gets to set the agenda, and our only role is to show up, debate the bill, and cast our ballot. Our Democratic colleagues have given it the marquee treatment, a bill known as S1, with the symbolic numbering of the bill as the first, meaning the most important bill in their agenda. But rather than a bipartisan bill that will be good for the entire country, not just one political party or the other, the majority leader has chosen to tee up this massive federal election takeover bill. This legislation first popped in 2019 when the newly elected Democrat majority in the House went on a messaging bill spree. A messaging bill is one that you really know will never become law, but it sends a message. And over the last 2 years, they've tried out a range of different marketing strategies. That's really all it is. It's not about passing legislation. It's about sending a message, trying to gain partisan political advantage. But they've tried a range of marketing strategies to convince the American people that this overhaul to our election system is necessary. At one point, it was a matter of election security, then of voter confidence, then a way that removed obstacles that prevented people of color from voting. Well, I've got some news for them. In 2020, we saw record election turnout. 2/3 of all eligible voters cast a ballot. That was the highest turnout in 120 years. And it wasn't confined to any single racial or ethnic group. It was across the board. We saw African American voter participation at virtually an all-time high. Same with Hispanics and every other ethnic and racial group. So, notwithstanding the facts that people are turning out to vote in historic numbers, they had to come up with a new sales pitch. They had to attack the efforts in the states to pass their own election laws, which handle the time and manner in which state elections are run. And to me, the consistent theme was making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. To me, that's the simple message I think we ought to be sending when it comes to our election laws. So that's what our colleagues latched onto. But over the last few months, they've twisted and turned and manipulated the facts beyond any recognition. They've tried to frame new state voting laws as the impetus or the reason justifying this massive federal takeover, unconstitutional in my view, takeover of state voting laws. They've painted an alarming picture of the assault on voter access. But if you actually take time to look at these so-called restrictions in voting, you'll find they're more generous than the current law in many Democratic-controlled states. There's no better example than the Georgia law, which came under national scrutiny for enacting reforms that would give Georgia voters more time to vote than voters in a number of blue states. Here are the facts, Madam President. In Georgia, the law that people claimed was racist and designed to prevent people of color from casting their ballot during the early voting season before on election day voting, the new Georgia law provides 17 days for in-person early voting. How about Massachusetts, currently represented by 2 Democratic senators? Well, Massachusetts provides 11 days. Delaware, represented by 2 Democrats, the home state of our president, it provides 10 days of early voting. New Jersey, also represented by 2 Democratic senators, provides 9 days, almost half of what Georgia has provided for in its new election laws. But what you heard across the news media, cable TVs, social media and the like, was that somehow, some way, Georgia had conspired to restrict the rights of African American and other minority voters from casting their ballot. But the facts prove otherwise. But this is the type of hypocrisy that we're seeing in this debate. As I said, New Jersey recently passed a law, just recently passed a law that expanded in-person voting to 9 days. Did anyone claim that this was somehow a Jim Crow relic or a racist act or violating the rights of African American and other minority voters? Of course not. Was New Jersey treated the same as Georgia was in the popular media, where it was suggested that somehow this was a racist effort to restrict minority access to voting? Of course not. But the New Jersey governor took it a step further. He actually criticized Georgia for what he called restricting the right of Georgians to vote. But his own state provides half the opportunity that the new Georgia law does to cast your ballot. Obviously, this is a bunch of political talk and an attempt to try to intimidate Congress and the American people into this federal takeover of state election laws. Well, we've heard similar attack lines from a number of our Democratic colleagues who have falsely tried to brand this law as a form of voter suppression, even though it's more generous than current laws in a number of blue states. Well, here's some more facts. We've heard a lot of talk about mail-in ballots. The Georgia law sets a deadline of 11 days before the election to request a mail-in ballot. But in the state of the majority leader, Senator Schumer, New York, voters only receive a week. So you got 7 days prior to election to request a mail-in ballot in New York, 11 days in Georgia, and for some reason our Democratic colleagues focus on Georgia and claim that this is some sort of conspiracy to diminish and restrict minority voting, which is clearly false. In New York, you also have to have a reason for voting absentee. But in Georgia, no excuse need to be given. You can do so as a matter of right, even if you're going to be in town, even if you're otherwise able to vote. If you find it more convenient to cast your ballot by mail in Georgia, you can do so, but not in New York. If any state tries to enact policies that suppress the votes of minority voters, there is a law in place currently, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that gives the U.S. government the right to sue that state or jurisdiction and make sure that minority voters have equal access to the ballot. Matter of fact, the Voting Rights Act has been one of the most successful laws ever passed by a federal Congress. And the historic turnout I referred to a few moments ago, I think is the best evidence of that. Minority voters across the country are voting in historically high numbers, which to me is the best evidence that the Voting Rights Act is doing exactly what we hoped it would do when we passed it and when we reauthorized it just a few short years ago. So if this isn't a solution to efforts to restrict minority voting, what exactly is this bill that we'll be voting on tomorrow, S1? Well, the truth is it's a partisan solution to a problem that doesn't exist. This law, if passed, S1, which we will vote on tomorrow, prevents the states from requiring identification from voters to vote. In other words, you don't have to show a driver's license or some other means of identification in order to cast your ballot. But in the Jimmy Carter, James Baker III commission, I think it was 2005, that bipartisan commission recommended voter ID as one of the important ways to maintain the integrity of the ballot so that the voting officials know you are who you say you are, and indeed you can check your name against the voter rolls to make sure that you're legally authorized to cast a ballot. But Senator Schumer's effort to pass S1, which we'll vote on tomorrow, prevents the states from asking for voter identification, even when virtually every state provides that identification card free. If you don't drive, they'll provide you a free card, and you can use alternative means of identification, but not if Senator Schumer's S1 bill were to pass. This bill, S1, would also tie the state's hands when it comes to maintaining accurate voter rolls. So if people have moved out of the state, or if voters have passed away, this law would tie the hands of the states to make sure that those names were removed from the voters' rolls, which would make it more likely that fraudulent efforts to cast those ballots on behalf of voters who either didn't exist or had moved out of state is possible. But S1 would tie the hands of the states to periodically purge dead voters from the voter rolls. This would also encourage something called ballot harvesting. Now, some states provide for ballot harvesting, but many thankfully do not. But ballot harvesting simply makes it possible for a partisan in a political campaign to go around and collect ballots, maybe at nursing homes, maybe at shopping malls, maybe at other places, and then they deliver those ballots to the voting clerk at the designated place and time. But you can imagine if the chain of custody of those ballots is not traced and tracked and monitored, just think of the opportunities that could provide for fraud. This bill also would alter the makeup of the Bipartisan Federal Election Commission to give the Democratic Party an advantage. Right now, there are equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats on the Federal Election Commission. That's the way it should be. But this bill, S1, would give the Democrats a partisan advantage, a big mistake. And here's maybe the biggest insult to the taxpayers. So whether or not you support a particular political candidate or the platform that candidate runs on, you can be forced to contribute your tax dollars to that political candidate to help them run and win the election. This is government funding, really taxpayer funding of political campaigns. And I believe it's a 2-to-6 ratio, if I'm not mistaken. For every $2 that the candidate raises, they get $6 in taxpayer funding to run their campaign. And that's your hard-earned money that you've paid in taxes that's being used to promote ideas and candidates that you don't support. Well, I could go on and on. The list of absurdities is a long one. But our friend, the senior senator from California, summed it up pretty well earlier this month. She said, if democracy were in jeopardy, I would want to protect it. But I don't see it being in jeopardy right now, close quote. So, Madam President, there is no voter suppression crisis, certainly not a systemic one. And if there is a problem with suppressing minority votes, there is authority available under the Voting Rights Act for the Attorney General, appointed by Joe Biden and confirmed by the Senate, to be able to go after them. There's no widespread effort to stop voters from casting a ballot, and there's no desire to hand states' constitutional authorities over to the federal government. Our Democratic colleagues are struggling to accept this reality. They spent the last several days working behind the scenes to negotiate a compromise among themselves. Well, there was never a question of whether or not this would be a bipartisan bill because of the overreach that I've just talked about. The question was whether or not the bipartisan opposition seen in the House would continue in the Senate. But even if Democrats were to accept all of the changes proposed by Senator Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, and endorsed by Stacey Abrams, the rotten core of this bill remains the same. This is a politically motivated federal takeover of our elections, and it will not stand. The Constitution doesn't give the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to govern how states run their elections. That's reserved to the states by the Constitution of the United States of America. I will firmly oppose any effort to hand Texas's constitutional rights to regulate and conduct its elections to the federal government. A one-size-fits-all federal mandate won't improve public confidence in our elections. It will be seen for what it is in a transparent way, a partisan political takeover, a coup d'etat, really, of the way that our elections are run. Elections should be run by the folks who are elected and who are accountable to the states, in my state, Texas, and certainly not partisan political actors with an agenda here in Washington, D.C. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
The senator from New York.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the measure. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 172.
Questions on the measure? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Deborah L. Boardman of Maryland to be United States District Judge for the District of Maryland.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 172, Deborah L. Boardman of Maryland to be United States District Judge for the District of Maryland, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 128.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Candace Jackson Akawumi of Illinois to be United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 128, Candace Jackson Akawumi of Illinois to be United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, January 21, be waived.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Madam President, before I begin, I want to first take a moment and remember those that lost their lives in a horrific car accident in Butler County, Alabama this past weekend. 10 people lost their lives. 9 of those were between ages 9 months and 17 years old. A majority of those killed were in a Tallapoosa County Girls Ranch bus. The Girls Ranch is an organization that I've been involved with for 20 years. It handles young kids that have been abused, young kids that have no parents. They start at this ranch at most any age, and everything's paid for all the way through graduation of college. These kids were on a field trip coming from Baldwin County, Alabama this past weekend, involved in this horrific crash. There's no words that can bring the comfort to these families or these children. But my family and my staff and the people of Alabama are praying for peace for all these affected during this unimaginable time. Madam President, as I and others have noted, Democrats call their flagship voting bill For the People Act. But a better and more fitting title is the Nancy Pelosi Power Grab Act. My Republican colleagues have done a good job of highlighting the many flaws of this legislation in the past couple of weeks, including doing away with common sense fraud protection like voter ID, forcing mandatory same-day registration on every state, allowing paid political operatives to harvest voter ballots, and directing taxpayer dollars to the campaigns of progressive politicians. Sadly, there's plenty more. But let me also note that this recent quote, compromise, is anything but. A compromise among Democrats should have been their starting offer to Republicans, not their final offer. The most recent versions still run afoul of the Constitution by trampling on the First Amendment rights of free speech and taking away redistricting from the states. And while ID is still required to vote, the bill expands what kind of ID meets that requirement, such as a utility bill. But the last time I looked, there was not a photo on our utility bill. The most secure form of identification is a government-issued photo ID. States shouldn't be forced to water that down. Americans want faith and trust in the integrity of their election process. This bill does not provide solutions to strengthen these processes. And once Americans learn what's in this bill, they will agree. The Pelosi power grab yanks power from the states. The Pelosi power grab lets politicians stuff their pockets with taxpayers' dollars. And guess what, folks? A slightly different version of a federal takeover of election is still a federal takeover of elections. That's exactly what this new version of S1 is. It's hard to even call this version of S1 a compromise when the Democrats only compromise with members of their own party. This was not a bipartisan negotiation to get an end product that both sides of the aisle could support. The last time I checked, we still have a 50-50 Senate. There has been no negotiation with our side. But regardless of its form, this bill does not solve the problems currently facing our election system. It makes the problems worse. You know, in sports, one team changing the rules by themselves is called cheating. It is seen for what is, a power grab. It is stacking the rules to win the game instead of doing the hard work necessary to get the job done. Folks may be scratching their head as to why one political party thinks they can completely change the rules of elections all by themselves. But if you've been paying attention to what the progressives have been up to recently, it won't come as a big surprise. Changing our country as we know it is the end game. That's why they want to pass this Pelosi power grab, so those who disagree with them have a harder time winning at the ballot box. But it's not just elections. Remember when they tried to hoodwink us with defund the police last year? Remember when they tried to walk that back? But they had made their position very clear. And now we're seeing the same thing with education, as critical race theory is pushed on school districts across the country. Simply put, critical race theory reinforces divisions on strict racial lines. It doesn't teach kids moral values like treating everyone with respect, regardless of race. It's just the opposite. Critical race theory teaches kids to hate one another. That's one thing schools should absolutely not be teaching. But again, for Democrats, it's about changing the way we view our country. What we should be focusing on is actually improving education all over this country. The American people need to realize how far we've fallen behind. As a columnist Mark Stein wrote, quote, "Education is the biggest structural defect in our society. We have almost entirely corrupt and abusive education establishment." Here's where that education establishment has got us. We're 37th in the world in math, 13th in reading, 18th in science. In 2019, only 35% of our fourth graders, 35% of our fourth graders were able to read at the fourth grade reading level. 35%. Embarrassing. That was lower than 2 years before. And it was before the teachers' unions kept kids out of school all of this past year. You can imagine how it is today. It is unacceptable. It should be unacceptable to every member of this body. We've got China outpacing us in every industry and at every level of our economy, but Democrats are too busy painting the United States as the world's villain. How can we expect our young people to defend the United States abroad if they don't learn about the things that make America the greatest country in the history of the world? We, as elected representatives of Americans across the country, should be doing everything, and I mean everything, we can to create opportunity and to protect the freedoms that make this country great. It seems like folks across the aisle aren't interested in that. They have a completely different vision of and for our country. One that most Americans don't agree with at all. I bet if you ask folks back home if they want a bigger government and less state and local power, they'd say, no way. I bet if you ask them if a federal power grab sounds like a good idea, they would say no. I bet if you ask them if they want their kids to learn to be more divided by race, they would also say no. They would tell you that they want their freedoms protected. They would tell you that they want the federal government out of the way. They want an education for children that provides opportunity, because education is the key to freedom and success. Education can unlock every student's God-given potential. But critical race theory swallows that key. The Pelosi power grab just fills the lock with cement. Ladies and gentlemen, For the People Act is one party's attempt to rewrite the rules of the game in hope that they'll get a permanent advantage, plain and simple. It's really a shame. We're spending so much time on bills that the American people don't want, bills that don't have bipartisan support. So I urge my colleagues to come together and find solutions that will unite us as Americans, not divide us further as a country. Thank you, Madam President. Nobody's up. For a quorum call?
Clerk will report the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm here today to address Democrats' deceptively labeled For the People Act, which should more accurately be labeled the For the Politicians Act. This legislation represents a breathtaking, unprecedented power grab. In a 50-50 Senate, this is a blatant attempt by those who are in power by the slimmest possible margin to take over and rewrite the election and campaign rules for all 50 states in one fell swoop. This would be done on an entirely partisan basis to ensure candidates from that same party win elections. In fact, while the only supporters of the bill are Democrats, there is bipartisan opposition to this legislation. This legislation would disenfranchise every American through the federal seizure of the authority of each state's representatives to set election rules for their states in accordance with the wishes of their citizens. And this partisan legislation would wash away election integrity measures, making it easier to cheat. Each invalid vote cast dilutes the strength of each valid vote cast. Our form of government for the people and by the people rests upon voters' faith in the integrity of our elections. If we allow that faith in our elections to continue to be compromised, we're allowing the very foundation of our American system to be eroded. Democrats don't want to talk about the details of this legislation. They don't want you to peek under the hood. They want to just slap a voting rights bumper sticker on it, jam it through, and then disparage and name call anyone who opposes it. So let's take a look at exactly what's in this legislation. Under this legislation, a federal politician running for election could take millions in taxpayer money for his or her own campaign. The legislation says that states must then allow that politician to pay political operatives to visit nursing homes, dormitories, emergency shelters, other residences, to collect thousands of ballots, and then choose which ones to be dropped into unmanned drop boxes, maybe in the middle of the night. This bill would make it illegal for states to verify the identity of voters at the polls. Under this bill, ballots arriving even a week after Election Day would still be counted. It would require states to adopt universal mail-in voting practices. States would be forced to allow murderers, rapists, and child molesters to vote, even if a state's citizens have adopted laws to prevent it. It would require states to allow unregistered voters to cast ballots by simply showing up on Election Day and signing a form without an ID and with no vetting allowed. The bill would silence political speech by religious and nonprofit organizations, while politicians can use taxpayer dollars to air attack ads with which many Americans would find distasteful. The bill provides that if anyone disputes any of this, that's okay. They can lodge their complaints with the Federal Election Commission, a body that has been bipartisan since its creation. But wait, in addition to changing the rules to benefit one team, the legislation also buys off the umpire by transforming the FEC into a partisan, Democrat-controlled body, a body that could hound the opposing party candidates to the ends of the earth. This bill transforms the judge into the prosecutor. I wish that was all the legislation did. It also snatches the responsibility for drawing congressional districts for the elected representatives of all 50 states who have done that job for the last 230 years. And it sets up a Byzantine process that would ultimately hand it over to an academic consultant hired by a liberal judge right here in Washington. Let me repeat that. A consultant hired by a judge in Washington, D.C. will be drawing every congressional district in the country. Using government power to seize control of elections, to limit speech, to pack tribunals to ensure the ruling party stays in power, well, that sounds like a headline you'd hear in Venezuela, in Russia, Iran, or even China, not the United States of America. Not too long ago, both parties would have considered this partisan power grab beyond the pale. But far-left operatives want permanent power. And Democrats, eager to keep the power to themselves, are afraid to tell them no. Democrats are now characterizing this legislation as an emergency response to recent legislation in a few states. This legislation isn't just a solution in search of a problem. It's a power grab that for years has been in search of a crisis, any crisis, manufactured or otherwise, that can be used to justify it. Democrat operatives introduced a previous bill on January 24th, 2017, 4 days after President Trump took office. The purported crisis then was the American people's election of Donald Trump, which the Democrats found unacceptable. They continued this effort by introducing yet another version of the For the Politicians Act in 2019, which that time passed the House without a single Republican vote. Like the bill the Senate will consider this week, this bill was a Democrat operative's electioneering fantasy, federalizing unlimited mail voting, prohibiting voter ID requirements, and allowing unregistered voters to show up and vote on Election Day. Wisely, the Senate in 2019 never took it up. Then as the pandemic took root in the spring of 2020, Democrats, in search of yet a new crisis to justify this bill, included it in a pandemic relief bill that the House passed, again without a single Republican vote. Once again, the Senate dismissed it and wisely focused on providing partisan pandemic relief rather than using the pandemic as a justification to federalize elections. With the pandemic now in the rearview mirror, this legislation is being pitched as necessary to preserve voting rights, using cartoonish, overheated, and false characterizations of a few sensible, measured voting integrity laws that have recently been enacted by states. Why? Because Democrats have to invent a new crisis every 6 months or so to conceal this quest to install themselves permanently into power. Don't let them fool you. This isn't about some state election law. The House passed virtually the same bill last year. Most of the components of this bill have been floating around Democrat National Committee back rooms for years. This isn't about voting rights. This legislation protects voting rights like banning security guards at banks would protect bank depositors. Now, why are the Democrats so desperate to pass this bill? Well, a recent report from Politico explains it. Politico says what's at stake is potentially the future Democratic majorities. Many in the party privately worry that frontline Democrats could lose their seats if Congress doesn't pass this bill. So to keep power, Democrats have determined they have to take over state elections. This is about holding on to power and nothing else. There doesn't seem to be a power grab that's too extreme for the modern left, whether it's this bill, legislation to pack the Supreme Court, suddenly changing their position and pushing to scrap fundamental Senate rules in order to obtain short-term political gains, or adding Washington, D.C. as a state. It's all about one thing: fulfilling a fantasy of permanent Democrat power. Under this legislation, American elections would no longer be about earning the support of voters by communicating a powerful vision. Rather, American elections would be all about creating the largest machine, identifying favorable voters, and mass gathering their ballots door to door as efficiently as possible. The winning campaign would be the one with the largest army of ballot harvesters to drive voters, registered or unregistered, with or without ID, to fill out and hand over a ballot that will be dropped on their behalf in unmanned ballot boxes. Americans want common sense laws that make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. Such laws currently exist throughout the country. That's why we had record-breaking voter participation in 2020, including in my state of Tennessee. This legislation is as unnecessary as it is misguided and dangerous. It's a politician protection measure that would do irreparable damage to the fabric of this country, and it should be soundly rejected by this body. Madam Chair, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin,
Madam President,
Senator from Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed.
Without objection.
Madam President, this Saturday was Juneteenth, the first official Juneteenth recognized by the federal government as a national holiday, the official end of slavery in America. I commemorated and celebrated Juneteenth with my colleague, Senator Van Hollen, at a meeting of the NAACP chapter in Reynoldstown, Maryland. And we reflected on the progress that we've made since the end of slavery and the challenges that still remain. It's been a long path towards justice and equality in this country. And I think we all recognize the wisdom of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with his famous quote that the moral arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think we all believe that, but in recent actions taken by state governments to restrict voting rights, we've seen some very disturbing trends that would take issue with Dr. King's statement that the moral universe is bending towards justice. It seems like it's taken a detour. Voting rights is a fundamental issue of importance to a democratic country. And Madam President, after elections are over and we win, we celebrate. We celebrate the fact that we've gotten the support of the majority of the voters, and that was what democracy is all about. If we don't win, and I think many of us have been involved in campaigns where our candidates have not been successful, we go to work to try to attract more voters in the next election so we can celebrate a victory. That's what participation in a free society is all about. That's what democracies are about. In repressive autocratic regimes, they'll never accept the will of the people. So they look at ways in which they can undermine the voter record, what the voters want to do, the voters' will. In the 2020 elections, we should all celebrate the record number of people who cast their ballots. It was a record. Most ever casting their votes for the presidency of the United States. There was repeated reviews done by both Democrats and Republicans at the national level and the state level, at the local level. And it verified the simple fact that there was no widespread corruption, that the will of the people prevailed, and Joe Biden, Kamala Harris were elected president and vice president of the United States. But that did not stop former President Trump in promoting the big lie. As a result of that, several states have now taken action to make it harder for people to cast their votes. The Brennan Center has pointed out that we've seen the worst assault on voting rights since Jim Crow. 14 states have enacted 22 new laws to make it more difficult for people to vote. This is unprecedented in modern times. So what have those laws done? Made it more difficult for voters to vote by mail, recognizing that for many voters, they prefer to vote by mail. We have states that have 100% voting by mail. There's been no indication of fraud in voting by mail. States have shortened the time for requesting mail-in ballots for voting, making it more difficult for individuals to be able to vote by mail, requiring certain requirements to vote by mail, making it more difficult to deliver their mail ballots, limiting the availability of mail ballot drop boxes. All that have been included. Why? Because it makes it more difficult for people who are likely to vote for my opponent to vote. That's what the state legislatures were doing. Stricter signature requirements, making in-person voting more difficult, and purging voter rolls simply because a person did not vote. Again, making it more difficult for people to vote. And it goes on and on and on the types of legislation that has already passed or is currently being considered by many state legislatures around the country, making it more difficult to register to vote, making it more difficult to vote, targeting potential voters more likely to vote for their opponents, targeting minorities, young voters, and older minority voters. Let me just give one example. Using Georgia as a specific example, the recently enacted changes will disproportionately hurt Black voters. The Georgia state law imposes voter identification requirements on absentee ballots, makes it hard to request an absentee ballot, and makes it a crime for groups to provide food and water to voters waiting in line. Georgia is basically restricting mail voting in response to a shift in the racial demographics of the voters who use it. On the other hand, Georgia wants to keep mail voting available for older white male voters. Voter suppression is always unacceptable, and the razor-thin political margins in Georgia may mean that the suppression efforts like these will change political outcomes. Rather than imposing barriers to casting the sacred right to vote, Georgia should be looking at ways to improve voter access. As the New York Times pointed out, the Georgia law comes on the heels of a major upset for Republicans in the traditionally red state, after voters picked Joe Biden in the presidential election and elected Democrats to both the state's U.S. Senate seats. The paper noted that the new Georgia law will, in particular, curtail ballot access for voters in booming urban and suburban counties home to many Democrats. President Biden was right to call this legislation the Jim Crow in the 21st century. There are many other examples. Georgia is not unique in the efforts we're seeing to suppress voter participation at elections. Look, it's fair game to try to persuade voters to vote for your candidate. It's not fair game to suppress their right to vote. So, what is the vote this week all about? The vote that we're going to have on bringing forward the opportunity to debate voter suppression legislation to protect the right to vote. It's simply a motion to proceed with a debate on the Senate floor. Let me repeat that. We're not voting on S1, the passage of it. We're not voting on any specific proposal. I know my friend from West Virginia has offered a proposal. We're not voting on that. We're voting on the right for the Senate to take up this critically important issue, or whether it should be filibustered so we can't bring up a voter issue to protect the integrity of the right to vote. Now, I support S1. I'm a co-sponsor of S1 for the people. I'm proud to support the provisions of that bill. To me, it's a carefully drafted legislation to deal with the modern threats to voter participation. And I am extremely proud that my colleague from Maryland, Congressman John Sarbanes, is the principal sponsor of H.R. 1 in the House that already passed the House. It provides a basic federal floor on protection of the right to vote, on voter registration, on voter by mail, no excuse balloting, 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends, no notary requirement for absentee ballots, drop-off boxes. It's just simple voter protection against the actions being taken by state legislatures that are aimed at certain demographic groups. A federal floor. It ends political gerrymandering. I don't know how any of my colleagues can defend the way that legislative and congressional lines are drawn today. I came from the state legislature. I'm a former Speaker of the House. I was responsible for one of the redistricting plans in Maryland when I was Speaker of the House. It's just a horrible partisan political process that we use today to draw congressional lines. I've been accused by my congressional colleagues in the House from Maryland that I ran for the Senate to avoid having to deal with congressional redistricting. There may be some truth to that. But I can tell you this, it is time to end political gerrymandering. Congressional districts should represent the community's interests, not an individual congressman's interests. S1 takes a major step forward in ending political congressional redistricting by gerrymandering. It provides a commitment by Congress to advance pre-clearance formula that was in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that now is non-operative because of the Shelby County decision. It puts us on a path to once again have that important tool available in order to deal with the freedom and right of vote. It promotes voter security, S1, by eliminating the paper ballot, by requiring the paper ballot, I should say, not eliminating, by requiring a paper trail. I think we all agree that we want to be able to verify votes the only way you can if there's a paper trail, and it provides for that paper trail. It puts an end to the dominance of big money in the political system. They do that in a couple ways. One, disclosure. How can anyone be against the disclosure of who's putting money into our political system? And secondly, providing a way in which we can get rid of the dependence upon large special interest dollars. It includes S1, two provisions that I authored. One, Deceptive Practices Act, that deals with false and misleading advertisements which are aimed at targeting minority communities to confuse and mislead their votes. And it includes the Democracy Restoration Act that I authored that deals with laws passed after the end of slavery and an effort to prevent African Americans from voting. For you see, there are states that passed laws back then that are still on the books that disqualifies for a lifetime a person convicted of a felony. The definition of felony is pretty general in many states. So we have states that where 1 out of 5 African Americans have been disqualified from voting because of their conviction of a felony, even though they are fully part of our society today. They don't have the right to vote. We need to remove that disqualification on voting. My friend, our former colleague, John Lewis, the two of us were elected to the United States House of Representatives on the same day. In an editorial published after his death, our former colleague, John Lewis, recalled an important lesson taught by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I quote our former colleague. He said, "Each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part." Well, Madam President, we cannot take action if we don't start. And we can't start unless my colleagues allow us to proceed to this issue on the floor of the United States Senate. There's a reason why there are so many groups behind us taking action. I had Facebook Live that I do every 2 weeks with my constituents. Jana Morgan from the Declaration for American Democracy, which represents over 180 groups, from labor to racial justice groups, faith groups, women's rights groups, environmental good governance groups, all telling us we need to move forward to protect our democracy, that the Senate needs to act on this issue. One of my guests, Virginia K. Solomon from the League of Women Voters. Now, the League of Women Voters, you can say a lot of things about them, but you can't accuse them of being partisan because they're not. It's one of our premier nonpartisan institutions in America with a proud history. They're telling us to take this bill up and act for the sake of protecting our democracy. We then have a chance to act, to take up amendments and vote on concerns, whether they are offered by a Republican senator or a Democratic senator. That's what the motion proceeds allows us to do, to take up these issues so we can vote on them. But if you vote to filibuster the motion to proceed, we can't even bring the issue up on the Senate floor for action. Madam President, I urge my colleagues not to filibuster the right of the United States Senate to start the debate on protecting voter integrity, where each member will have an opportunity to debate the issue, and collectively we can come together. As many of my colleagues have offered suggestions about how we can improve S1, how we can make it a broader consensus. But we can't do that unless we have the right to proceed to a debate. I urge my colleagues to support the cloture motion on the motion to proceed so the Senate can take up this most critically important issue to the preservation of our democracy and the integrity of the right to vote. With that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to complete my remarks prior to the roll call vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. If the Constitution is the foundation of our republic, then the concept of one person, one vote is the cornerstone. It's also a promise that every single eligible voter in America takes with them into that voting booth on election day. It gives them confidence that their vote matters. It helps them to keep the faith in our electoral system and in their local government. We can talk about the vote on a grand scale here in Washington, but that's where it really matters. Back home, at your local polling place, in your home county, and in the precincts with the people who do the work of standing up elections, running elections, and certifying their own elections. Madam President, it is of the people, by the people, for the people that this process is carried out in each and every one of our counties. And you know what, Madam President? That is how it is supposed to be. Article 1, Section 4 of our Constitution clearly states, here it is, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Well, how about that? The Constitution delegates that authority to the state legislatures. And that is why our state secretaries of state work with our counties to make certain that the process is put in place. You know, I have had the opportunity to serve on my county's local election commission prior to my being in elective office. One person, one vote. That is the number one rule that guided the decisions they made. When we recruited poll workers, it's the number one concern that drives people to go sign up. When we train the volunteers that are staffing polling places, it's the number one rule to teach. Every person gets one vote. All legally cast votes are counted. That's the way it is supposed to work. One person, one vote. Here in the Senate, I'm concerned that my Democratic colleagues have forgotten about this rule. Why else would they once again pledge to move a piece of legislation that would throw one person, one vote out the window? Many of my Republican colleagues have taken to calling H1 or S1 the Politicians Protection Act or the For the Politicians Act. And I will have to agree that is a fairly apt description. Now, there are a lot of problems with this bill, but I want to focus on a few key provisions that will gut one person, one vote, and destroy confidence in our elections. If this bill passes, say goodbye to meaningful voter ID laws. Now, my Democratic colleagues kept the idea of these requirements intact, but to please their radical base, they added a loophole that would force every single jurisdiction to accept affidavits in lieu of identification. That is right, an affidavit. They may as well have banned voter IDs because that loophole makes requirements that voters prove they are who they say they are absolutely meaningless. They can just sign a statement saying, I am who I say I am, without having to show proof. The bill also requires states to allow paid campaign operatives to engage in ballot harvesting schemes. That is right. This allows your paid campaign operatives to engage in ballot harvesting schemes. Now, these ballot harvesting schemes have been proven time and again to increase the risk of fraud, so much so that many states on their own moved forward and banned ballot harvesting schemes. Why did they ban this? Because it leads to fraud in elections. Inexplicably, my colleagues also want to throw ballot drop boxes into the mix. They've pitched them as a convenience, but that convenience will be nearly impossible to monitor and to protect 24 hours a day, which means that it will be nearly impossible to monitor and protect the ballots that are inside those boxes. And these boxes then become a fairly convenient way to stuff the ballot box. But perhaps the most dangerous, counterproductive, and outright infuriating provision my Democratic colleagues have included in this mess of a bill is a restriction against voter roll maintenance. Anyone with a bit of common sense knows how inaccurate or duplicate entries in a data set can add up. That leaves these data sets in a state of disrepair, and that is how fraud and mistakes occur. It's just one more provision in a bill raising red flags for local officials in every single state in this country. And this red flag in particular is prompting people to ask me if my Democratic colleagues involved in drafting this bill have ever actually volunteered at a local polling place, which that really tells you a lot about how short-sighted this legislation is. Madam President, this bill really doesn't have anything to do with voting rights. This is a politically motivated federal takeover of elections that would give us the exact opposite of what's laid out in the Constitution. The founders granted the states power over their own elections for a reason. The federal government is beyond incompetent to get this job done. If you like the service you get from the IRS or the EPA or OSHA, that's what you could expect the next time your community has an election. If we allow this bill to pass, the promise of one person, one vote will crumble. The promise of counting eligible ballots and not counting ineligible ballots would go by the wayside. And what do you get in exchange? The promise of chaos, confusion, and a lack of confidence in the integrity of the vote. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the remainder of my remarks be placed separately in the record.
Without objection.
The time has come for Team Blackburn to say goodbye to our fearless leader and current Chief of Staff, Chuck Flint. Chuck first joined my team in the House as a member of our legislative staff. He was eager to prove himself capable and well-versed on our legislative issues, and I will tell you, he succeeded. In the 7 years since he first walked through my office door, he has grown into one of the finest office and chief of staff that I have seen on the Hill, and one of the finest political strategists here on Capitol Hill, one of my most trusted advisors, and I will add, the most enthusiastic softball player on Team Whiskey Business. The most enthusiastic I think we've ever fielded. I wish Chuck, Jessica, and little Everett all the hope and happiness in the world as they embark on their next beautiful adventure together. We will miss him tremendously, but no matter how far they travel, they will always have a home with Team Blackburn and in service to the volunteer state. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 149, Christopher Charles Fonzone of Pennsylvania, to be General Counsel of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Christopher Charles Fonzone of Pennsylvania to be General Counsel of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Orono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Asa. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Resch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz.
Well, I know why I wasn't invited, looking at the crowd. I don't know about.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blunt, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Klobuchar, Manchin, Markey, Murkowski, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Warnock, Warren. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Cotton, Crapo, Ernst, Fisher, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Lankford, Marshall, Moran, Portman, Romney, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker. Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Miss Lummis, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 35. The motion is agreed to. The senator from New York.
Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader, in consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 1520, and the Senate proceed to its consideration that there be 2 hours for debate equally divided in the usual form, and that upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on the bill with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving my right to object, I thank my colleague from New York, but once again, I object to her request for the reasons I have previously stated. I also want to thank her for the courtesy of presenting the unanimous consent immediately. I appreciate that very much. Mr. President, I am the first chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee to endorse the types of changes the senator from New York has proposed as they apply to sex-related offenses under the UCMJ. As I have said, it is my intent to include the administration's proposals in the base markup of the defense bill next month, subject to amendment. And I anticipate numerous amendments being offered by members from both sides of the aisle. Further, as I've already committed, the committee will consider these proposals to include a vote on them in committee, if that is what any senator desires. That is, in fact, the tradition of the committee. If a member wants to vote on an amendment, we will vote. I would note that according to committee records, there has not been a vote on this proposal in the committee since 2013, 8 years ago, and has not even been introduced as an amendment in committee since that time. I look forward to having this debate when the committee meets to mark up the fiscal year 2022 defense bill. With that, Mr. President, I would reiterate my objection and again thank the senator for her willingness to introduce the unanimous consent initially.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
So it's very kind that the chairman notes that the last time we got a vote in committee was 2013. We've been asking for a vote on this for the last 8 years, asking for the last 5 years to get a floor vote and been denied. This bill has been routinely and roundly filibustered and opposed by the chairman and the ranking member for the entire 8 years that I've been working on this bill. And this bicameral bill that has 66 Senate co-sponsors should not be relegated to a committee that will communicate with the DOD behind the scenes. That is what they do. That's what they have been doing. This is not a bill related to a technical aspect of warfighting that would benefit from the expertise found within the DOD. It is a check on the commander's power that has been allowed a culture to flourish where 2 in 3 victims do not feel comfortable coming forward to report their assault, and 64%, a number that is stubbornly unchanged, experience retaliation when they do come forward. Moreover, a majority of the SASC members already co-sponsor this bill, so it's unclear what expertise the committee will add. It will only create an opportunity for the DOD to water down this much-needed reform. As a military law expert, Brennan Feisel wrote today in The Hill, quote, "An institution with the power to kill people and topple governments should not resist our elected senators' clear will. Cheering as a procedural loophole allows a small minority to prevent popular reforms from being implemented." Mr. President, this is the 12th time that I have risen to ask for unanimous consent for a very simple reason. The Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act deserves a vote. The people in the military deserve a military justice system worthy of their sacrifice. We don't have time to delay. Every day that we delay a vote on this, more service members are being sexually assaulted and raped. I started this request for unanimous consent 28 days ago. Since then, an estimated 1,568 service members have been raped or sexually assaulted. More will have been victims of other serious crimes. And most of them will feel that there's no point in even reporting the crime because they have no faith in the current military justice system. That system asks commanders, not lawyers, to decide whether cases should go forward. The lack of faith is understandable. Less than 1 in 10 sexual assault cases are considered for command action that are actually sent to trial, and just a small fraction of those end in conviction. And in the 8 years that we've been fighting for this reform, further fault lines in the military justice system have been made evident, including deeply troubling racial disparities. It's a disappointment that the chairman is not here to hear this information himself, but in 2017, a report found Black service members were as much as 2.61 times more likely to have disciplinary action taken against them as their white counterparts. And in 2019, the GAO found Black and Hispanic service members were more likely than white service members to be subjected to criminal investigation and to face general and special court martials. Those statistics show a clear and pressing need to address what appears to be inherent bias in the current command-controlled system. To provide our service members with real justice, we must move all serious crimes out of the chain of command. This bill will do that by making a simple but critical change to the way the military justice system handles serious crime. It streamlines how cases move forward. Instead of commanders who have zero formal legal training making the decision to prefer or refer cases to trial decisions, this bill gives those legal decisions to highly trained, impartial, professional military justice lawyers. And it allows the commander to continue to work hand in hand with judge advocates to implement good order and discipline in their unit. The bill really comes down to one thing. Is there enough evidence to move this case forward? We should not put that responsibility on commanders who often know both the accused and the accuser and do not have legalized training to be able to make these decisions properly. When it comes to serious crimes that can lead to long, more than a year sentences, that decision should be made by a legal expert. That's the change the bill would make. It's tailored, it's simple, it's an elegant solution to meet a very real problem. Commanders still have lots of power. They have the ability to enact non-judicial punishment, which allows them to set the tone for their troops and maintain good order and discipline. They will still have the ability to put people on restriction and in confinement. They still have the ability to issue protective orders. These are the basic tools that commanders rely on to implement good order and discipline, not general court-martial. And if a serious crime is not preferred and then referred by the JAG convening authority, it goes right back to the commander, who can choose to do several things. He can do nothing. He can carry out non-judicial punishment or administrative separation. He can pursue summary or special court-martial. However, this change, despite its simplicity and despite being a very small change, will create a seismic shift in how the military justice system is perceived by both service members who have been subjected to sexual assault and by Black and brown service members who have been subjected to bias. We need a professionalized military justice system so that everyone, from survivors to defendants' rights, can have more trust in the current process. A process that is based on evidence and legal facts, and that cases will be decided impartially. That's the system our service members deserve, and is the system that we create by the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act. We've tried every small ball effort you could imagine. Mr. President, you've been in on that committee for years. You've watched us pass every type of reform that the DOD is okay with. This is the one they have fought tooth and nail to prevent implementation. And even today, our chairman wants to narrow it down, reduce it to a very small size, one crime only. Well, let's just look at the facts. The Vanessa Guillen case was a murder case. Under the chairman's own analysis, he would not have allowed that case to go forward through the review of a special trained military prosecutor. In fact, her case may never have seen the light of day. That's a problem. So we need to treat all serious crimes the same. We've compromised on this bill. We've carved out all the serious crimes that are military in nature, going AWOL, not following a direct command, anything that the commander would have a special purview over. But we draw a bright line at the rest of those serious crimes, and that's a good solution. It's what our allies have already done. UK, Israel, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Australia, and they saw no diminution in command control. We need to build the military justice system that is worthy of the sacrifices that the men and women in our armed services make every day. I would now like to yield the floor to the senator from Iowa.
Senator Gillibrand. Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
I think we just heard the senator from New York speak very strongly about the need for this legislation. She said 12 times she's come to the Senate floor to ask for UC on this bill. So we all ought to know, not only on this bill, but a lot of things the senator from New York's involved in, she's not going to give up. And 8 years on this bill proves that, her persistence. We need to get this done. And I would think that a bill that has 66 co-sponsors and the demonstration for is such that the people opposing this would be embarrassed, particularly with the 66 co-sponsors. So I thank Senator Gillibrand for her persistence. I've been glad to be with her on this subject. I haven't worked on it as hard as she has, but I believe in everything she has said, and this bill should pass. In the last 15 years, there's been virtually no progress in reducing the level of sexual assault in the military. Far too many servicemen and women have experienced sexual assault, and we don't even know the full extent of the problem because people are afraid to report these because of retribution that happens as a result of the report. Of those who do report, 64% experience retaliation. But this goes beyond sexual assault. This legislation professionalizes the military justice system and would improve trust and transparency in the ability of the military to handle all serious crimes. The policy of moving the decision to prosecute out of the chain of command has been recommended by military justice experts. This bill has been considered by the Armed Services Committee for 8 years in a row. And that's why time has come now to make sure that this bill does not get buried once again in that committee, or as she suggested, very narrowly narrowed. The committee has had more than enough time to review the legislation and propose alternatives. We've even heard from the Department of Defense that they can solve this problem, and yet it keeps getting worse. This bill with so many co-sponsors deserves the support and shouldn't have to wait any longer to get passed. It's time for the legislation to finally move forward, and I urge my colleagues to join in this effort to get this done the easiest way possible, and that would be by UC. I yield the floor.
Quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
The senator from South Carolina.
I'd ask to be recognized for 10 minutes.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I'd ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. I have been listening today and a few other days, I think, about Senator Gillibrand's efforts to bring up what I think is a major reform of the military justice system to the point where you won't recognize it as it is today. And I hope you understand what you're being asked to do here. So Senator Reid, who's the chairman of the committee, has been objecting. And before I got here, I was a military lawyer and active duty in the reserves for about 33 years. I was prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge. And what I'd like to challenge the body to do is find me cases where the judge advocate has recommended prosecution in a sexual assault case in the last 8 years, and the commander refused to go forward. I was in the military, JAG Corps, for 33 years. I can only remember one time where that was even an issue. And previous efforts to reform the system works like the following. If the JAG recommends a prosecution in a sexual assault case, as defined in the last piece of legislation, and they refuse to go forward, is taken to the commander's commander. So what problem are we trying to solve here? What we're doing in this bill is relieving the chain of command when it comes to military justice. If the commander no longer is concerned about sexual assaults in the barracks, we've made a huge mistake. The heart and soul of the military justice system is to provide a fair trial to the accused, take care of victims, but give the commander the tools they need for good order and discipline. So the idea of taking the commander out of the chain of the command when it comes to terrible things like sexual assault, I think is a bad idea, because it's the commander's job to make sure that unit works well. And having a bunch of professional prosecutors make the decision without the commander being involved is basically relieving the commander of what's best for that unit overall. Sexual assault is a problem in the military, it's a problem in the civilian world, it's a problem all over the place. But the military justice system is designed to bring about good order and discipline. And I can only say that the day that the commander is taken out of the responsibility for what happens in that unit is a bad day for good order and discipline, and I think a bad day for that unit. Again, the legal advice given to commanders in cases like we're talking about is almost universally followed. There's probably been more occasions where the commander will take a iffy case to court just to make a point, cases that would never probably get off first base in the civilian world. But the people pushing this bill always talk about results in court martials. I think the worst thing the United States Senate could do is create an impression that a not guilty verdict is unacceptable in the military. Sometimes a not guilty verdict is the right answer to the situation presented to the court.
So I'm beginning to doubt whether or not you can get a fair trial in the military if you're accused of one of these crimes. When politicians attack results in the system, we're sending a pretty clear signal if you're on a court-martial panel member that we're going to be grading your homework here in the Senate because there seems to be a bias that the only outcome must be a guilty verdict. Truth of the matter is, a lot of women go to their grave having been assaulted and never report the event to anybody. And we need to make it easier for victims to come forward. But on occasion, people are accused of things they didn't do. I've been involved in many of these cases, and on occasions, you'll find out that the accusation doesn't hold water, not sufficient to be anywhere near beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes people say things are just flat not true. So what I worry about, Mr. President, is that in our effort to reform the system to solve a problem that really doesn't exist, commanders ignoring the JAGs and not prosecuting people because they like them or they have favoritism, that's not a problem. If you want to talk about reforming the military justice system, fine. Let's don't stand here in the United States Senate and say that commanders in the military routinely turn down legal advice to prosecute. They don't. That's just not true. In the military, in a general court-martial, you need 3/4 to convict. If we're going to go down this track of talking about what an acceptable outcome should be, then I'm going to start introducing legislation to change the requirement of the verdict to be unanimous. I was a prosecutor for 4.5 years and a defense attorney for 2. I understand sort of the military courtroom environment, and the panel members, the members of the jury, are commissioned officers, or you can request non-commissioned officers. The accused has that right up to a certain percentage of the panel. And these panels are constructed not like a civilian court. They're constructed to make sure that the jury usually comes from the officer corps and people with the responsibility for that base are picked to serve on these juries to make sure that the base is being well run, people receive justice who've been violated, and those accused of a crime have a fair trial. The worst thing can happen is when a commander seems to have favorites and the people he likes get away with almost anything, and the people the commander doesn't like, well, they look for reasons to come down hard on them. So when I was a young JAG, I'd go talk to commanders and first sergeants. The worst thing you can do to a unit is to play favorites. Call them as you see them. You need to show up in the middle of the night as a commander and first sergeant in the barracks. When they least think you're going to come, just let people know you're watching them, because most enlisted people are 18 to 22-year-old, first time away from home. So we've made some strides that I think are good. We provide victims of sexual assault in the military with their own individual counsel. Most people don't get that in the civilian world. We're trying to train prosecutors how to handle these cases. I like that. But if we're going to start creating a presumption here, contrary to being innocent, that there's only one right answer, then we need to start training a bunch of defense attorneys and having a specialty there. Because the worst thing that can happen in a military unit is for somebody to be assaulted, be treated poorly, and nothing happens. And second to that is for somebody to be accused of something that is seen as not legitimate. And that's why you have trials. That's why you have defense attorneys. That's why you have judges. That's why you have prosecutors. But the thing unique about the military is this not a jury of your peers. The jury is made up of the officer corps on that base who has responsibilities usually to run the base. And you can request it as a enlisted member that a part of the panel be enlisted but they're going to be the most senior ranks on the base. They're not going to be E3 and 4s. They're going to be E8s and E9s. They're going to be the senior enlisted corps responsible for good order and discipline and morale on the base. That's what's unique about the military justice system. I found as a defense attorney that people look long and hard at the government's case. I'll talk later on about some cases I had where people were accused of using drugs by urinalysis, and the system was fatally flawed, and over time the military justice system got that right. So I just want Senator Reid to know that slowing this train down and getting the members of this body to understand what we're talking about, I will support him more. I should be down here talking more. Like everybody else, we're busy. So I promise to come down more to give my side of what we should be thinking about in terms of reform, and why what's before us is not reform. It's a radical change to the military justice system based on what I think a premise that doesn't exist. The one thing I want you to know, I don't believe there are a handful of cases in the Army, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Navy a year where the commander refuses to go forward after the JAGs have recommended a court-martial in sexual assault cases. And that's what we're all supposed to be worried about, that the system is biased against victims. What can we do to make it easier to report these situations? What can we do to convince people that the command is not going to turn on you if you're a victim? These are all legitimate things. But to fire the entire chain of command based on a premise that I think doesn't hold water, would be bad, and would over time undercut the military's ability to maintain good order and discipline and to be the effective fighting force. So Senator Reid, as the chairman of the committee, I will try to do more to help him. I respect Senator Gillibrand a lot. She's very passionate about this. But all I can say is that passion and justice has to be measured. And we have to be making decisions based on facts, not just an outcome that we would like. And when we start talking about cases where somebody was acquitted as if that was the wrong result, that scares the hell out of me. With that, I will yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are,
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
Mr. President, I'm here on the Senate floor this afternoon to call on President Biden to withdraw his nomination to lead the Bureau of Land Management, Tracy Stone Manning. He should withdraw her for the reasons I'm going to talk about here on the Senate floor. But let me stipulate, while I have often spoken about what I consider far left extremists, environmentalists who are taking over many elements of the Biden administration, often in the context of why I have voted against their confirmation, I have not yet called on, haven't in my entire Senate career, a nomination to be withdrawn before they even have gone through their Senate confirmation hearing before a Senate committee. But I'm doing it this afternoon. The reason I've never done this before, Mr. President, is that's because we have not yet confronted someone with Tracy Stone Manning's past, which involves being a member, part of an extreme group that performed violent acts as part of their platform for getting attention in America. Violence, a group engaging in overt eco-terrorism. By the way, Mr. President, this is becoming a bipartisan issue, a serious bipartisan issue, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. The director of BLM from the Obama-Biden administration just yesterday made a statement saying if these allegations are true, which they are, then that he firmly believes that her nomination should be withdrawn by the president. That's Mr. Bob Abbey. So this is a serious issue, and it's a bipartisan issue. Before I talk about Tracy Stone Manning's involvement with eco-terrorism, let me start by saying that BLM is an incredibly important and very powerful federal agency, particularly as it relates to my state, the great state of Alaska. The Alaska BLM manages more surface and subsurface acres in my state than any other state in the country by far. In fact, I haven't done the math, but I believe that they manage more acreage in Alaska than they do the rest of the lower 48 combined. That's how important BLM is in my state. Let me give you some of the numbers. This includes over 70 million surface acres of land and 220 million subsurface acres. That's the land equivalent to about 1/5 of the entire lower 48 states. Most states can't even comprehend that size. 1/5 of the lower 48 of the United States of America is the amount of land BLM manages just in the great state of Alaska. So it's a huge amount of land, and of course, by definition, it's a huge amount of power that this federal agency has over my state and the people I'm honored to represent. And Mr. President, it is imperative that the director of this agency, the Bureau of Land Management, with so much power and so much control over my state and its future and economic opportunity for working Alaskan families, that the manager of BLM for the country be trustworthy, to be honest, to be fair-minded, to be beyond reproach, and certainly not to have been involved in an organization that perpetuated violence against its fellow Americans. And from what we know about Tracy Stone Manning, she is none of these things. Trustworthy, honest, and fair-minded. That this administration is full of people with far-left agendas certainly isn't surprising. We all know that the National Democratic Party is much further to the left than they were even 4 years ago with the Obama-Biden administration. But, Mr. President, what is shocking, beyond surprising, is that the President of the United States would put forward someone for this incredibly important position, BLM, who is not only far left, but from a member of a group that was an eco-terrorist organization. A group that was undertaking violence against their fellow Americans so they could make a point on environmental issues in America. This is not an exaggeration. Tracy Stone Manning was a member of Earth First, a radical far-left group that has engaged repeatedly in what is defined as eco-terrorism. But, Mr. President, she wasn't just a member of Earth First. She herself is complicit in putting metal spikes, big, thick ones, in trees that were meant to either threaten to hurt or gravely injure those Americans who are harvesting trees, who are cutting down trees legally, who are putting trees in sawmills legally. This was a common technique, tree spiking, deployed by such eco-terrorists in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Earth First called such tactics, quote, monkey wrenching. That's kind of cute. Dangerous, could kill people. Monkey wrenching. Logging crews and the Americans who are legally harvesting timber in our country might have called such tactics terrifying, and certainly called such tactics very, very dangerous. So let me briefly talk about the group that Tracy Stone Manning was a member of. Earth First began in 1980 by disaffected environmentalists who thought the movement wasn't radical enough, who thought the movement wasn't getting enough attention. So they founded a new group that wanted to get more attention, sometimes by perpetuating violence. Among its proposed founding principles, quote, all human decisions should consider Earth first, mankind second. I'm quoting now. Mankind second. Okay. Not sure many U.S. senators would agree with that. And quote, the only true test of morality is whether an action, individual, social, or political, benefits the earth, unquote. These are founding principles of this organization. Given these principles, it's no mystery that the group's slogan is this, quote, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. Mr. President, in their view, no compromise meant destroying property, putting steel spikes in trees that could kill someone trying to harvest a tree. And Earth First celebrated and encouraged such actions. The group even put out a manual, yes, a manual, detailing tree spiking and instructions on how to do other sabotage activities, cut down power lines, flatten tires, burn machinery of those who are trying to harvest trees legally. We harvest trees legally in Alaska. We have loggers who do that, who are from hardworking families. David Foreman, the founder of Earth First, talked about all of these activities, and he said, this is where the eco-tour can have fun. That's a quote from the founder, Earth First. Fun. That's what he called this. Fun. Tell that to those violently hurt by some of Earth First tactics. This is how an article in the Washington Post from this time described such an incident of tree spiking that severely, violently hurt one of our fellow Americans. And now I'm going to quote from this article, Mr. President. Quote, George Alexander, a third-generation mill worker, was just starting his shift at the Louisiana Pacific Lumber Mill in Cloverdale, California, when the log that would alter his life rolled down his conveyor belt toward a high-speed saw he was working on. By the way, Madam President, I've seen these saws in Alaska, in mills in Alaska. They are huge. This isn't just some kind of tiny saw. They are gigantic, and they spin at incredibly fast speeds with huge teeth. They're dangerous, even when you're operating without tree spikes in the trees. Let me continue. Here's the continuation of this article from the Washington Post. It was May 1987. George Alexander was 23 years old. His job was to split logs. He was nearly 3 feet away when the log he was working on hit his saw, and the saw, this giant saw, exploded. One half of the blade stuck in the log. The other half hit Alexander in the head. Again, these are giant saws, tearing through his safety helmet, tearing through his face shield. His face was slashed from eye to chin. His teeth were smashed, and his jaw was cut in half. That's what Earth First did to this young American doing his job with a tree spike in it. I'm continuing with the Washington Post article. George Alexander had never even heard of a sabotage tactic called tree spiking until he himself had become a victim of eco-terrorism. Washington Post word, not my word, eco-terrorism. Someone who objected to tree cutting had embedded a huge steel spike in that log that violently jammed the saw and changed George Alexander's life. Tree spiking. That's the Washington Post. These were the kind of tactics that Tracy Stone Manning, the Biden administration's choice to lead BLM for America, once conspired in. Does that disturb you, America? Every U.S. senator on the floor here in this body should be very, very disturbed. And Mr. President, and now I'm talking to the President of the United States, think about this, sir. I say respectfully, come on, man. This is the most qualified American citizen you can find to be the BLM director? She was part of a group, not just a radical extreme environmental group, but a radical extreme violent environmental group. President Biden, this should be a red line that we all agree to. No nominees who conducted violence against their fellow Americans. So what did she do specifically? The Biden administration's director of BLM, nominated director of BLM. Here's what she did. In 1989, she did a friend, a fellow Earth First colleague, comrade maybe is a better word. She did a friend, a comrade, a fellow comrade a favor. She wrote, word for word, a profane, anonymous letter from this member of Earth First about the 500 pounds of tree spikes that Earth First had hammered into trees in Idaho by Earth First. Pretty dangerous, pretty violent. She rewrote the letter on a rented typewriter because she later told a reporter, quote, her fingerprints were all over it. So she knew she was obviously involved in criminal activity. So she didn't just handwrite it. She didn't want her fingerprints on it. She typed it. She then sent the letter to the FBI. She kept quiet for what she did for years. That was in 1989, until she came forward in 1993 and received immunity for her part in this tree spiking in Idaho. 500 pounds of spikes. This is a serious operation. Deadly, could be deadly. She received immunity for her part in this tree spiking when prosecutors went after the other members of Earth First. And she testified about it. Here's something that should be very simple for all of us. No matter how young, no matter how naive, the director of the Bureau of Land Management for the United States of America should not, and I repeat, should not have ever been involved in eco-terrorism. That is simply unacceptable. And the President of the United States should get that, and certainly every U.S. Senator should get that. Working with people who were so radical on environmental issues that they thought it was okay to perpetuate violence against their fellow American citizens. Come on, man. President Biden, you cannot be serious. Now, it's not only me who thinks that this is an outrage. I want to compliment my Senate colleague, Senator Barrasso, who has been doing a great job. Fortunately, our press has been asleep at the switch. Senator Barrasso has been doing a great job of highlighting these very issues. But as I said earlier, this is now becoming a bipartisan issue. It's not just me and Senator Barrasso. Who've been raising this issue. Just yesterday, Bob Abbey, who led the BLM from 2009 through 2012 under President Obama and Vice President Biden, said the following, quote, if the reports regarding Ms. Stone Manning's involvement with spiking trees are true, then I firmly believe she should immediately withdraw her name from further consideration for the BLM director job, unquote. Let me read that again. The BLM director from the Obama-Biden administration just yesterday said the following, if reports are true regarding Ms. Stone Manning's involvement with spiking trees are true, then I firmly believe she should immediately withdraw her name from further consideration for the BLM director job, unquote. Well, guess what? The reports about her involvement with tree spiking by the eco-terrorist organization Earth First, meant to harm her fellow Americans, are true. They're true. Madam President, there are other issues that also call into question Ms. Stone Manning's character. I'm not going to get into these. I'll let others focus on them, low interest loans, other things. That's, in some ways, in my view, a distraction. Her involvement with an organization that was focused on eco-terrorism certainly disqualifies her. And the President of the United States should know this. Now, I didn't agree with Bob Abbey on much when he was the head of BLM under the Obama-Biden administration, but I certainly agree with him about Tracy Stone Manning. And I believe the President of the United States should withdraw her name from further consideration. And if the President doesn't do that, because he gets a pressure from the extreme left, then I certainly hope that my colleagues here in the United States Senate, Democrats and Republicans, will resoundingly vote to reject this nomination when it comes to the Senate floor. Yes, we have differences on issues of resource development, energy for America, certainly issues of jobs and resource development in my great state, the great state of Alaska. We have differences, there's no doubt about it. But here's the thing, we all know, and I think every one of us, all 100 senators, know and would say publicly that these differences should be resolved peacefully in debates here on the Senate floor, at the ballot box, arguing these issues forcefully, yes, but not violently, not with violence. So if this nominee comes to this floor, it shouldn't be even a close vote. It should be 100-0 rejecting her. And to my Democratic colleagues, I hope you join me, like Mr. Bob Abbey, in saying, Mr. President, guess what? You screwed up here. Withdraw her. But if he won't do that, I hope every U.S. senator votes against this. We cannot condone, endorse, or vote somebody who has been part of an eco-terrorist, radical, extreme, violent organization. And my colleagues, America will be watching. If you vote for her, you got to go home and explain that vote to your fellow Americans. As I mentioned, it's one thing for this administration to put forward far-left, extreme, environmental nominees. It is quite another to put forward a far-left, extreme, violent environmental nominee. And that's what she is. So to the President of the United States, respectfully, sir, you need to withdraw this nomination. And to my colleagues on the Senate floor here, respectfully to all of you, the President doesn't take this common sense action. We need to decisively reject this nominee when it comes to the floor of the United States Senate. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
And Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. Tuesday, June 22, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, upon conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Fonzone nomination post-cloture. That post-cloture debate time expired 11:45. Further, that the Senate recess following the cloture vote on the Yahuwah nomination until 2:15 to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. That if cloture is invoked on the Yahuwah nomination, all post-cloture time expires at 2:30 p.m. Following the disposition of the Yahuwah nomination, the Senate proceed to legislative session and resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-2093, with time until 5:30 p.m. equally divided between the two leaders or their designees, that the cloture motion on the motion to proceed to S-2093 ripen at 5:30, and finally, that if any of the nominations are confirmed, the motions to be considered, made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it stand adjourned under the previous order, following the remarks of Senator Whitehouse.
Without objection.
Quorum? No.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I want to speak briefly this evening about S1, the Senate version of HR1, the democracy reform bill that we're going to be considering moving to proceed to. I hope to be able to show a unified Democratic caucus moving to proceed. It's often described as the voting rights bill, and it's described that way with good justification because there's some very, very important protections that are built into it to protect the voting rights of Americans, which are under, I would say, a unique and historic threat now since the perhaps 50s and 60s, when the Voting Rights Act was passed and some of the levers that were pulled to keep certain people from voting had to be stopped, and the vote and the ballot became available much more broadly and led to a much more just society. But that is not the only part of S1. In fact, in my view, it's not even the central part of S1. In my view, the central part of S1 is getting big, unlimited, anonymous money out of politics. Now, the two relate because the big, anonymous money schemers that are up to no good in politics are focusing on, guess what? Voter suppression. And in fact, the same individual, the same person who was running the dark money scheme to control and capture the Supreme Court and the circuit courts has, after being somewhat blown up by a Washington Post expose about the $250 million he was running in dark money through this court capture scheme, jumped from the court capture scheme, and where did he land? On something rather ironically called the Honest Elections Project, which immediately went to work to file lawsuits and harass election officials and try to make sure that voter suppression took place. And if you think that's a coincidence, the Honest Elections Project is actually a rebrand of an entity that was called the Judicial Education Project. Basically just a name change through corporate hijinks. And that Judicial Education Project is the corporate sibling of something called the Judicial Crisis Network. And guess what the Judicial Crisis Network did? For this same guy, before he jumped to voter suppression, when he was still doing court capture, Judicial Crisis Network took the big fat checks that anonymous donors wrote to pay for the TV campaigns, the dark money TV campaigns, against Garland and for Gorsuch in the first appointment, for Kavanaugh through all of his troubles in the second appointment, and then for Judge Barrett on the eve of the election in the third appointment. So you see the same person and the same organizational connection between the court capture dark money scheme and the voter suppression dark money scheme. It's actually happening in kind of plain light of day, except that we don't pay enough attention to the links. So this dark money business, getting the big dark money out of politics, is a big, big deal. And I wanted to share how big a deal it is to Americans. Dark money corruption polls at the top of all the issues in the last poll I saw. It's the number one issue. And if you ask people, if somebody says that they've dedicated themselves to fighting corruption, is that going to make you more likely to vote for them or more likely to vote for their opponent? All right? Among all voters, it's 89-1. More likely to vote for the candidate dedicated to fighting corruption versus whoever this one is who said, nah, not such a big deal to me. Among independent voters, who the two parties always fight for in elections, 82-2. 82% of independent voters would be more likely to vote for somebody who they see as dedicated to fighting corruption, and only 2 would be more likely to vote for their opponent. So this is a strong public signal that we are sick of it. And you see it over and over again. This is one poll. You can go through poll after poll after poll, and you see people want the dark money out of politics. They think we're controlled by big special interests. They think too much stuff gets done behind the scenes. And by the way, we just got a little window into the private conversations about this that take place between the Koch brothers political apparatus and our minority leader, Mitch McConnell's political apparatus. And Jane Mayer wrote about this recently in the New Yorker. And the Koch political apparatus and the Mitch McConnell political apparatus were being briefed on this bill, on S1, and on these provisions. And what they were told by the pollster is, you know what? We're in big trouble. Because our conservative voters hate this damn dark money stuff just as badly as those liberals do. And we've tried all these different ways to reframe this, to make it look bad, so they might be more against it. None of it worked. None of it worked. People want their government cleaned up. They're sick to death of big special interest money, and they're particularly sick to death of big special interest money that hides behind fake front groups. So that it's not ExxonMobil or Marathon Petroleum that comes to Rhode Island and says, Sheldon Whitehouse is a bum, you should vote against him. No, it's some little phony group with a name like Rhode Islanders for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity. And all they are is a mail drop. Somebody's behind them, and the voters know in Rhode Island, there is no Rhode Islanders for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity. They know they're being had, and they're sick of seeing the ads, and it's not fair to them as citizens to not know what's going on in the American governmental process going on right in front of them. And it matters to them. It really matters to them. It's the single most important issue for 55% of all voters. And among the independent voters we're trying to attract to our separate parties, 58% of independent voters, this question of big money corruption and government not listening to them, the single most important issue. The single most important issue. Now, make it top three. Expand the question. What are the top three most important issues that you care about? 89% of all voters have this in their top three. 88% of independent voters have this in their top three. So let's say you've got a real concern about healthcare. Or let's say you've got a real concern about voting rights. Or let's say you've got a real concern about the economy. Never mind, this is still there in that top three for pretty much 9 out of every 10 Americans. And what's the level of concern? Very concerned. Very concerned is 86% of all voters and 92% of independent voters. About this issue of corruption and money in politics, how concerned are you? 86% of all voters said very. 92% of independent voters said very. And if you say, okay, let's again expand the aperture a little, very concerned or somewhat concerned? Are you very concerned or somewhat concerned about this dark money, corruption, special interest pressure in government? 98% of all voters, 100% of independent voters. I don't know about you all. I've looked at a lot of polling in my life. Seeing a 100% number, that is rare. Every single independent voter polled is very or somewhat concerned about corruption in our democracy. So I can't wait to get on to S1. And if our Republican friends want to filibuster it and stop us from moving forward, I can't wait to see them explain to their voters back home why they made the choice to come here and against 89-1 for all voters and 82-2 for independent voters, take that brave stand for dark money and more corruption and more special interest pressure in our politics. Good luck with that. I hope at some point we bring that fight to the floor and we spend weeks on it so that as we go into next year, every single American has seen this play out. They have seen that this issue that they are very concerned about, that for more than half of them is the single most important issue, that there is a party here in the Senate that is determined schemers, the special interests behind the dark money corruption. Good luck taking that to the voters in November. So to those who are listening and who are thinking, you know, I don't see how we get around a filibuster here. I love S1. This is a really important bill. We've got to get there. We hope that the Democrats can unite on this, but even then it's only 50-1 or 51-1 if the vice president is allowed to vote. And that's not 60, so there's a filibuster. My answer is give it effort and give it time. Because once Americans, everybody from a Tea Partier to a Bernie bro, gets wind of which party in here is the party of special interest dark money, who wants to protect that, like I said, single most important issue. People go into the voting booth and they tend to remember the single most important issue, the issue that they're very concerned about, 86% of all voters. So I hope we find a good way forward. I think it's important for our democracy that the rottenness of all this come to an end. I don't want to see more of these academic studies that show that Congress listens to big special interests, provably, statistically, and Congress doesn't listen to regular voters, provably, statistically, because of this kind of dark money pressure. We got to get beyond that. We got a country out there to put back on its feet, not only economically, but in terms of being able to hold our own heads high about having an honest government that is an example to the rest of the world. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.